Good afternoon, good morning, everyone, and welcome back to our CASP webinar series of 2024. And it's the sort of final webinar series on the topic, in the sense of it's the final one where we are covering the final two case studies on administrative traditions in Ghana and Mauritius. So thank you very much to all the loyal CASP friends who are here today, and we have come to some sort of conclusion so far that we look forward to expand further in the upcoming months. And in regards to what CASP is, we are the Center for African Smart Public Value Governance, and we were set up in 2020. And every year so far, we have organized either a webinar series or a lecture series, or focus on specific theme. And our aims are of both a practical nature and a theoretical nature. We hope to enhance theory building in management studies, organization studies, from an African perspective. And practically as well, we seek to improve the discussions about, to improve the quality of public governance approaches in Africa. So that's a little bit of a brief overview about what we do. And to the next slide, Imamdin. And yes, over to you, Imamdin, I believe. Or I'm going with the flow today. Apologize.
Hello also from my side to the last round of this webinar series, which we entitled Administrative Traditions in African Countries, based on Ty Peters' work, who is also again joining us on the concept of administrative traditions. So kind of certain types of how bureaucracy works that have quite often the origins in Europe, and due to colonial past have partly also been introduced to African countries. But of course, there have also been pre-colonial traditions, and our attempt throughout this year was to understand along six democracies in Africa, to understand, okay, how do the implementation of this administrative tradition and interplay with pre-colonial tradition look like in these six countries, Botswana, Cape Verde, Senegal, South Africa, and today about Ghana and Mauritius. So here, that's the timeline. As you can see, we are at the end of this year. We are still looking forward to a final webinar next year about in March, when we kind of also want to make a conclusion and a comparison about the six cases, but we are still we're going to give you some information at the end of this session. Thanks again to the Digitalization Committee of the University of Bern. They sponsored helping setting up this webinar. And so we want to come to today's speakers, which is Yaa A, Gyamfi, and Adeelah Kodabux, who helped introduce the presentation today also. So let me just get to my notice, because I would like to talk about the two speakers today, and what we kind of what we can learn from them. So I'm really looking forward to that. So first of all, Yaa A, Gyamfi, thank you very much. She is a lecturer of management at the China-Europe International Business School. She's based both in Shanghai and Accra, joining us today from China. Her background, she has a PhD in management from the IESE Business School in Spain. Her focus is on organizational behavior. She also did her master's degree in organizational behavior at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Her core interest is to understand the relationships between cultural identity, personal identity, identity resources, and multinational network contexts. How does this play out? How people get used to different cultures when they change and enter into multinational companies? So that's why also quite an interesting perspective to understand how administrators play out in the organization themselves. And we are looking forward to hear about her insights on the case of Ghana. Also, just to mention some kind of highlights from Nana Yaa's career. She's a very well-established scholar with really nice, interesting publications. I ask you also to look at them. One of it has been published at the Academy of Management Review, which is one of the leading management journals. She's been recently awarded the Woman in the Academy of International Business Emerging Scholar Award. She won the Best Dissertation Award in the Academy of Management in the division International Management. And herself, she's really active also in order to kind of push forward theory development, knowledge creation in the African context. Amongst others, she organized a 7-month paper development workshop and mentoring sessions for young African scholars. Also, welcome again, Adeelah Kodabux, who we are already familiar to, Doctor of Philosophy in International Relations from Middlesex University of London, former senior lecturer in the International Relations Department at Middlesex University, Mauritius. She focuses on African governance with an emphasis on theorizing the dynamics of global South actors in international relations, the BRICS. That's one of her, amongst others, focus of her research. And Adeelah Kodabux, we can really call her an entrepreneur. When I looked a bit what she did, she founded and is co-founder from different organizations and opportunities. So amongst others, as you probably know, she's co-founder of CASP, of our Center for African Smart Public Value Governance. She's founding member of the Mo Ibrahim Foundation's Now Generation Network. And as she was still bored, she recently founded LEDA, where she's acting as a director now. LEDA stands for Leading Enhancements in Data Analysis. So it's a research and advocacy organization with focus on data analysis related to African governance. Last but not least, she is a winner of the prestigious US Fulbright Visiting Scholar Award. Thanks to this award, and she got the opportunity to visit the University of Florida that she did, I think, last year. Time is running. And she brought back a lot of insights from there. So I'm really looking forward to the two presentations today to learn more about the two contexts, Ghana and Mauritius, how administrative traditions play out in those two countries, how do they interrelate with pre-colonial traditions, and what does it mean when we think about the future of public sector reforms, innovation, addressing grand challenges in those countries. So thank you very much for being here, for taking the time to talk about the two countries. So let's move now. I would say let's start with Ghana. Nana Yaa, I let you share the slides so that you can start your presentation.
Okay.
Also, what we're going to do again, we will have the two presentations, and at the end, we're going to have a joint discussion about the two presentations. So please, Nana Yaa.
Okay. I hope everyone can see my screen. All right. So thank you very much for that introduction, Emmy. And good evening. Thank you all for attending tonight's workshop. I'm going to be talking about administrative traditions in my country, Ghana. My name is, as Emmy said, Nana Yaa, and I like to introduce myself as Nana from Ghana because it rhymes and it makes it easier to remember. Now, I chose this particular picture that you see for two main reasons. First of all, because I thought it tied in the theme very well, but also because it shows very well a nice blend of the traditional and the modern, which I think is the theme of what we're going to be talking about in terms of administrative traditions in Ghana. What you're seeing here is two individuals, basically two members of a royal family sitting in state. So you can see from the man's, his dressing, he's wearing the traditional kente cloth. His jewelry shows that he is a royal. Usually, this kind of dressing is typical of the Akan. And his wife, on the other hand, is dressed in the kente cloth, but you can see some semblances of modernity there with the plastic hoops woven into her clothing and even her painted nails and her jewelry and her bag. So it's a very nice mix. And then the Ghana flag over there, I think, also brings to mind this idea of the very local facets of governance being woven into statesmanship. So how I'm going to present this is in 4 parts. So I'll start with an overview, tell you a bit about Ghana. Some of it you might already know, but some other statistics that might be interesting to know about the country, about our political system, how it's organized, some features of our central and local governments. Then I'll talk about the sources of our administrative tradition. So I'll talk about the pre-colonial era, what happened during the colonial era, and then what has been the case since. Then I'll go on to talk about forces. So basically the enduring influences from this pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial eras that give rise to the common features that we see in the public sector. And the last thing will be the resources. So that would be the consequences of these forces and what it means for the future of our public administration and civic life. So to begin, as most of us know, Ghana is a West African country. We are bordered on all sides by Francophone countries, even though we were colonized by the British and so we're Anglophone. And of course, we're along the coast, along the Gulf of Guinea. Some more information on Ghana. I won't go through everything in detail. Like I said, we're in West Africa. It's a 67-year-old nation because we gained independence from the British in 1957. It's classified by the World Bank as a lower middle income economy. Compared to other countries such as Nigeria and South Africa and Egypt, we're a small country in terms of our land size, just over 230,000 square kilometers, and also in terms of our population, just about a little over 33 million people as at 2022. Our labor force makes up almost half of our population, and we're mostly a youthful population, like most other African countries, especially the ones along the West African coast. Our official language is English, but there are over 56 local dialects spoken. In addition to those, other commonly spoken languages, there are French and Hausa. In fact, we study French because all our neighbors are Francophone countries. We study French from primary school through to junior and senior high school. The dominant religion is Christianity, but we also have a large and growing Muslim population. And then other people practice traditional religions and others. And some people are not religious at all. Our real GDP is a little over 70 billion US dollars as at 2022. Per capita is about a little over $2,000 annually. We're known for many different kinds of imports and exports. Well, the funny thing, it's not really funny actually, but we're known for exporting cocoa and gold in particular. But for me, if you ask about the imports, I'd say we just about import everything else, which is not good news for us. Now, in terms of our political system, we run a parliamentary democracy and we have an executive presidency. So this gentleman over here, who became quite renowned around the African continent during COVID for his leadership skills, they said, is our president, who is basically outgoing at this stage because we have national parliamentary and presidential elections coming up at the beginning of December. At the moment, he's not very popular because people have this sense that he's kind of just sitting down and counting the days till he gets to ride off into retirement and leaves us with whatever is left of our nation. In terms of our political landscape, as I hinted at earlier, we're a multi-party democracy with 4-year presidential terms, and each president gets to do up to 2 terms. So, for example, President Akufo-Addo has just done 8 years. He's ending this December, or in January next year, rather. And even though we're a multi-party democracy, our landscape is dominated by 2 main parties. So usually you either have the MPP in power, that is the current president's party, or the current opposition party, which is the NDC. And they usually seem to take turns, as if when we get tired of one party, we just get rid of them and bring the other party. As to whether they're truly different, that's up for debate. And then our governments, we try to achieve a balance of power by having three different arms of government: the executive, which is represented by the president and the cabinet, the legislature, which is our parliament, and then the judiciary. So I'll give a little more detail on these three distinctions. So the executive branch is led by the president. He appoints the ministers who comprise his cabinet. And then the Constitution also stipulates there should be a council of state. So it's more or less like a council of elders that advises the president. The legislative branch is made up of the parliament. It's headed by the Speaker of Parliament, and there are 275 members currently, each one representing a constituency. So each election we vote for the president, and then we vote for a member of parliament of the respective constituency that we live in. The judiciary is headed by the Chief Justice, and there's a system of courts that comprise the justice system of the country. So the highest courts in the land is the Supreme Court. Then we have the courts of appeal and so on. But most interestingly for our discussion today, you can see that when you look at the list of the lower courts, you see the traditional courts. So there are still very much courts in which you'll find local leaders, so local kings and chiefs running affairs, usually for more minor cases, civil cases usually, and we'll begin to discuss why some of those features exist in Ghana. Members of the Supreme Court are appointed by the president on advice of the Judicial Council. So unlike other countries which have maybe states or provinces, we have regions. We call them regions. So we have 16 administrative regions. They used to be 10, but from 2018, the current government split certain regions further. So now we have 16 administrative regions. And so the central government's level is made up of these three arms of government: the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary. And then their powers are supposed to more or less end at this level, right, at the breakdown of the different regions. But what we find is a bit different. We're supposed to have a local government system, which is mostly headed, I don't know if you can see my pointer at this level, the metropolitan assemblies, the municipal assemblies, and district assemblies. So these are supposed to work within the regional level and coming down more to the grassroots level. But as to how effective a local government system is, that's a different argument altogether. But I'll just run through it very quickly. So our local government is headed by the Ministry of Local Government and Rural Development. It is overseen by a regional coordinating council. So remember the 16 administrative regions. Each region has a coordinating council that's supposed to oversee this local government system. And there used to be about 65 MMDAs by 1988, but as at last year, we had more than 250. So we have 261 to be precise. 6 of them are metropolitan. Those are the largest ones, most populous ones. There are also 109 municipal assemblies and 145 ordinary assemblies, which are the smallest ones you'll find. They gain their sources from the sources of funding from the central governments. They also have all kinds of licenses, fees, and taxes that they're able to collect, including property rates, for example. And then the local governments have political and administrative responsibilities, which mostly have to do with local developments. They also deal in what you call even minutiae, such as, how to manage sanitation and waste services. They have certain health facilities that fall under their purview, and so on and so forth. The heads of the MMDAs are selected by the president. So the head of any MMDA is supposed to be the district chief executive, the DCE. The metropolitan assemblies are headed by the mayors, for example. So those are appointed by the president. Majority of their members are elected, but there's a certain proportion that's reserved for the president to select. And local elections within these assemblies are supposed to be apolitical, and political parties are supposed to more or less keep out of it. So on paper, that's what's said, but in reality, what happens is quite a bit different. So that's basically an overview of how our governance or our public administration generally works, and how our governance occurs within the country at the central government level and the local government level. Now, the question is, how did this come about? Where have we started from in order to have these features? And then perhaps maybe we can also begin to trace. So we'll start from the pre-colonial era. from the beginning of known history up to about the 15th century, the region which comprises Ghana's land area was occupied by independent states. These were monarchical states which were headed by kings or chiefs or some other form of recognized leader. One of the oldest of these states is the Dagon states, which still exist in northern Ghana. There was the Bono states, Akwemo states, the very famous Ashanti states, Ghana and Ewe, and so on and so forth. Now, up until the 15th century, when the Europeans arrived along the coast, so Ghana used to be called the Gold Coast. Up until the arrival of the Europeans along the coast, the Ashanti had coalesced so much power that they were the most dominant ethnic group or the most dominant state within the region, which generally is now known as Ghana. And these states were, as I said, governed by leaders who were either installed or enshrined. Installed or enskinned. So they were usually already existing political systems. They had usually certain systems of inheritance. So you were either became king after your father or after your uncle, depending on what's the different states prescribed. They had councils of elders. They had recognizable systems of government in place. They had very clear customs, even though they didn't have written traditions. They had very clear orally passed down traditions on how leadership was passed down, what leaders were supposed to do, and what the rules and regulations of society were. Some of the major trade towns that were known are the capital cities of these major states. And when the first Europeans to arrive in 1471 was the Portuguese, who arrived along the coast of the Gold Coast at that time. They were soon followed by other Europeans, such as the French, the English, the Dutch, Swedes, Danes, and Prussians. Initially, they arrived to trade, and they were mostly trading in gold, which was abundant, and hence gave the region its name as the Gold Coast. But by the 17th century, they had shifted into trading in slaves. And the logical progression was because slavery was something that was already being practiced in the region. One of the things that the Ashantis and other tribes would do is that they would feud or form alliances with other states, and they would take prisoners of war to work for them and so on. So when the Europeans arrived along the coast and they became interested in dealing in these humans, it was just very easy for them to offload their excess cargo or excess human cargo in that way. And make some money off of it. So that was the origin of the slave trade. It was actually a local practice before it became internationalized. So in terms of colonial government, what happened is that from 1471, when the first Europeans arrived, there was a lot of trade going on between the Europeans and the locals. But over time, the British began to again consolidate their power within that region. So the British government began to seize privately held lands along the coast, obviously because they had superior arms, also because they had also managed to gain the trust of some of the local chiefs. Some of them were actually gifting them land, and some of them were taking more land than they had been allocated, through trickery and so on. And then some of them just went ahead and outright seized the lands. They also purchased interests of other European their counterparts, such as the Danes and the Dutch. And then they also gained some of the lands through conquest. So they fought several wars with the Ashantis, obviously, who saw them as a major threat. The biggest of those wars, there were about 4 major wars between the Ashanti and the British. The last one, which was the biggest one that led to the definitive conquering in the sense of Ashanti land, was in 1896. And then they also sort of, the Fantis thought they were entering into an alliance with the British before they realized they were a colony. So they were never conquered, and they keep insisting that they were never colonized, but they ended up being a colony anyway. Very interesting history. But the Gold Coast was officially established in 1901, and it was made up of 3 distinct regions. The Gold Coast Protectorate, which was mostly the lands along the south, the Ashanti, and then the Northern Territories. So you realize that even though they were formed as one sort of state being ruled by the British, they still kept their distinct identities, which still prevails to this day. This is said to be the badge of the Gold Coast. And then the question for our purposes today is, what influence does this British rule have on Ghana's current administrative system? So the British colonial era was the first time that the country was organized according to a centralized government structure. Like you mentioned before, there were all these little groups, these states that were governing themselves and had their own ways of life. The colonial era was the first time that there was a sort of overarching governance structure over them. The thing that was unique about them is that the British still governed through the chiefs. So they either intimidated them, conquered them, or bribed them. Some of them actually had very good relations with some of these local leaders. And then they managed to implement their rules and laws through them. And it was also within this colonial era that the British common law became adopted as the law of the land, in many ways superseding some of the local customs and traditions. So there was this very interesting mix of cultures and administrative, legislative, and other traditions. Now, transitioning out of the colonial legacy, we have a bit of a timeline here. So around 1945, that was the end of the Second World War, there was an increasing sense of nationalism in the country. So first of all, the British had been involving more and more locals in public administration. So obviously the British officials took the highest roles, but then there were more and more Ghanaians who were being educated and taking up some of these roles. Now, the more educated they became, the more the middle class grew, the more sort of power and autonomy they wanted over their own land. And the biggest catalyst for independence actually came at the end of the World War, like I mentioned earlier, because the soldiers who had fought for the British in the war came back and had very terrible economic conditions. Times were very hard for them. And so they started to really catalyze all these agitations and strikes and protests and so on. And it sort of created a groundswell movement, especially because some of these riots turned violent when the British, for example, fired on a crowd of protesting soldiers. And that was really the catalyst for some of the stronger moves toward independence. Now, this gentleman is very well known across the continent. He's Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, our country's first president. He was somebody who emerged on the scene around this era, around 1949. He returned to Ghana from his studies in the UK. And then he got very much involved in some of the political groups that had begun to arise. And so he became embroiled in all of this, got arrested a few times, became more popular because he got arrested, and managed to form a party that won majority of the seats in the governing council in the Gold Coast at the time. And so he was invited by Her Majesty the Queen to form a government in her name in 1951. Now, within the period 1951 to 1955, he began to work with the governor of the Gold Coast toward transitioning Ghana into an independent country. And this transitional phase happened much quicker than anyone expected. So by 1957, they were comfortable to hand over entire control of the country to Ghanaians, and then Ghana became an independent state. Since that period, there have been a series of governments. Kwame Nkrumah himself was overthrown in a coup d'etat in 1960, and then there was a series of civilian governments overthrown by military coups and so on. So we've had 4 republics. We're currently in the 4th republic, and we've had a lot of military regimes in between. So the major trends in governance over this period have been 2. One has been towards centralization, right? Because Nkrumah himself had very socialist ideologies. He was very almost communist in his leanings. So he was very much in favor of big government being in charge of everything, taking care of everyone. But then one of the reasons why he was overthrown, and one of the popular features of the governments that have been in control since his governments have been decentralization. So this move toward what we currently see, where the country is supposed to be run according to the local government system, the metropolitan, municipal, and district assemblies. So these are some of the enduring features that we see in a public administration as a result of these different eras, the pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial. First, we have certain particular features in our civil service and bureaucracy. We have a shift to the market's mindset, but there's a very sticky welfare worldview where the government still plays a huge role in a lot of our economic activities. We have institutions for accountability, and then we have a strong role for chiefs and traditional authorities. Let me take each of these in turn. For our civil service and bureaucracy, it's very much modeled after the British civil service traditions. Because as I said, Nkrumah had this vision of the public service being the vehicle by which the nation developed. It's very much, well, it's supposed to be merit-based in terms of recruitment and advancement, but the emphasis is more on tenure, how long you've been in your office, academic achievements, how many academic degrees you're able to accumulate, and also the kind of personal favors that you carry. Bureaucratic challenges are rife. The public service is notoriously inefficient, inadequately staffed, and there's a lot of political interference. Now, in terms of the mindset challenges, we've had a lot of reforms and programs. Every few years, there's a new reform or some new program, probably from the World Bank or some bureaucrats getting together and coming up with a new brilliant idea, which ends up costing a lot of money and doesn't make that much change, if you ask me. And then there's also emphasis on privatization and market-driven reforms, but the public sector continues to have a chokehold on the economy. In recent years, at least since 2000 and so on, we've seen growth in the public sector, but not to the extent that we would have expected. We've also seen growing influence of civic groups and accountability groups such as the media, especially since 1992. The influence of the media has grown quite a bit. And the Public Accounts Committee, the Commission on Human Rights and Administrative Justice, and that sort of thing. So they were trying to prevent a totalitarian regime and having more civic groups and individual citizens having more of a voice in how the country is governed. And then we've had this very enduring presence of chiefs and traditional authorities who have been very consistent in national administration right from the pre-colonial era till now. So we have a coexistence of a formal state bureaucracy and the customary governance, and then continued influence of chiefs and traditional leaders, especially in rural areas. Now, it's even argued that in certain rural areas, they respect their chiefs or their paramount king even more than the president, and that is very much the case. And so we have this integration of traditional and modern systems. So, for example, as I mentioned earlier, if you look at the courts, we have the traditional courts where the chiefs actually sit and decide on cases. But usually these are cases which don't involve criminal activity. Those are usually reserved for the more the more formal courts. So now the forces, we've discussed the different influences that have led to the current tint and shade of public sector governance that we have. But what are the enduring influences that sort of keep things in the states that they are? I would say, and this you realize this coming strongly from my cross-cultural management orientation of research. The sticky cultural features that I think are very strong forces in how things occur within our public governance is, first of all, collectivism, which is defined by Herr Hofstede as the extent to which people define themselves in terms of groups rather than as individuals. So the very enduring feature that you find is that people are very much affiliated toward their own tribes. They are very much loyal to a particular chief or traditional leader. At the very least, you will find that people adhere very closely to their political parties. So that's one of the challenges that we have, that whoever is in power seems to have a chokehold on the public sector, even though you would wish that the public administration would run a bit more efficiently, that would have maybe technocrats and the politicians will be kept separate. That is not what happens. Now, another feature is power distance, which again is defined by Herr Hofstede as the extent to which less powerful members of an organization or institution accept and expect differential distribution of power. So in Ghana, you'll find that the boss is the boss who, even the chair that the boss sits on, no one sits on, that kind of attitude. And you can see how that would influence things like decision-making, even if it's supposed to be collective decision-making. There are certain things that will never be said, especially when the boss is present. And so it influences how resources are distributed. It influences actually how decisions are made, and almost every other part of public administration. So we have hierarchy and cronyism. There's more of an inkling toward getting close to power and being in the boss's good books, actually speaking truth to power and everyone bringing their individual strengths. There are also challenges with accountability because the boss is seen as entitled to the resources, entitled to the big car, entitled to change his car every year. And so those sometimes abuses of resources and power may not be questioned as much as they should be. And then the last one is about rites and rituals. And these are practices and procedures which are reminiscent of past protocols and even happen to endure long after their relevance is weakened or forgotten. So you realize that there's a lot of, and this might be more starkly contrasted against, for example, what may happen in Scandinavian countries, for example, where things are stripped down to the bare minimum and they try and avoid wastage of resources. You will find that, for example, a politician would go and outdoor a public toilet or a public restroom, for example, and the ceremony to go and cut the sword to outdoor this public restroom probably could cost another public restroom or an extra facility somewhere else. But we pride ourselves so much in ceremony and pomp because it's very much woven into what our local traditions are like. We have big festivals, big funerals. People can be sick in hospital and not have a single person pay their bill. But the moment they die, there's a lot of funds suddenly raised for a huge funeral. Those kinds of things. And they also seeps into how we govern and how we run our public service. So you see that there's a lot of superstition and resistance to change because people have a preference for the rites and rituals and the customs, how things have always been done. And then we also prefer symbolism, the rituals, the rites, and the big show of things rather than pragmatism, just going for the bare bones and minimizing wastage and all of that. So this is a huge feature of how our public services run. Now, resources. So what do all these things mean for the current phase of our public life and our coping going forward? I would like to maybe think of three main things. One has to do with diversity, the other one has to do with conflict avoidance, and the third has to do with apathy or helplessness, whichever way you want to look at it. Now, the first thing about diversity is that obviously, because of our past heritage, our very multifaceted, multicultural heritage, we have become very, very used to having different voices, different languages, different foods, and so on spoken around us. And I think Ghana is one of the better integrated multicultural societies where you find Christians and Muslims interwoven, and it's not a problem. If we have a national function, the imam will come and pray, and the pastor will also come and pray, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, the traditionalists will also come and pour libation, and those things coexist and are seen as perfectly normal. There's a lot of coexistence and religious tolerance. So diversity becomes a resource. It becomes a strength in that we have a multiplicity of backgrounds and cultures to draw from. The question is whether we are able to optimize this diversity. And this comes to the second thing, conflict avoidance. That because of our history of political instability, we've had stability just over since 1992, right? It hasn't been that long. So there's a lot of generational memory of a time when soldiers were in power, instituting coup d'etats, where people were summarily executed for being affiliated with a particular party or having been seen to be part of a certain corrupt system. And so there's a preference, especially among the older generations, for avoiding conflicts, avoiding wars, which has served our country well because we've had a series of peaceful or largely peaceful presidential elections every 4 years. But at the same time, that avoidance of conflict doesn't help us to truly engage and maybe also bring out what our main strengths are, because we know that in order to optimize diversity, you have to have an optimal level of convergence and divergence. And the other side of avoiding conflicts all the time is that we don't bring that out because we simply skirt over our differences. And another aspect of it is our cultural programming. In our culture, we have a lot of tendency toward peacemaking. And this is ironic because we had cultures that were constantly at war with each other. I mean, tribes that were constantly at war with each other. But within each tribe, there was such an emphasis on being together and on collectivism that there was always a tendency of people being advised to let go of conflicts, or if they were offended, to let go of things. So people prefer to let go of issues even to this day rather than maybe go to court or fight for their rights. We're seeing more of a shift among the youth now, and also with the rise of social media, copying what's going on in Nigeria and other places. People are beginning to engage more in things like public protests and so on, but that just hasn't been a very characteristic part of our national persona or national fabric. It's fairly new to us, and we use a lot of humor to overcome a lot of things. So one of the newest jokes in town is that just last week, our outgoing president, unveiled a golden statue of himself. And people were very, very upset about it. But rather than agitate and pull it down or burn, the facility that it was unveiled in down, people have just made a lot of jokes on social media. You turn on the radio and people are just pillorying him and that sort of thing. And that's really it's a potential tool for just keeping the peace. But we have to find ways of more critically engaging in national discourse. And then the last thing is apathy or helplessness, right? That we are very, very much aware of how sophisticated our institutions are, how deeply entrenched people's beliefs and the practices and so on are. And so people don't have a lot of hope that things will change, especially in terms of how our public systems are run or how our political system has been designed. People also have a very deep understanding of how deep the roots of things go. So if you go to a particular institution or you go to work for a public institution and their way of governance or their way of doing things isn't efficient, people rather tend to just go with the flow than try and change things, because there's just this sense or this awareness of how deep beliefs are and how deeply held these traditions are. And so this is one of the things that I think holds us back from really pursuing and achieving true change. So it just remains to be seen how much maybe the opening up of social media and the increase in globalization will speed up the overturning of some of these things, which features will remain and which features will be transformed, and what that means for the future of our public administration. So thank you so much for your time. This is all that I've wanted us to discuss today, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Really insightful. So I suggest let's move first to the second presentation, and then we can collect the questions together and also have comparative questions. So I hand over to Adeelah, please.
Yeah, thank you, Imamdin, and thank you very much, Nanaya. It was really good. I've visited Ghana once very briefly for a conference. I wish I had the introduction to Ghana's deep history before visiting it. Now I want to visit it all over again to immerse myself in the history and the richness of your society. And thank you, Imamdin, as well for the introduction earlier. I believe it's the first time that I've been introduced as an entrepreneur. But yeah, I would never consider that, given that I've just shifted from academia. But yes, today I am focusing on the case study of Mauritius, and I will be talking about the history of administrative traditions. Of course, to discuss contemporary administrative traditions, we need to focus on the colonial aspect. And I have more or less sort of a similar presentation structure as Nanaya, although you started with the contemporary aspects and then delved into the colonial history. Perhaps I'm starting with the colonial history of Mauritius first, and then going to the post-colonial administrative traditions. Having said that, my presentation to understand the administrative traditions of Mauritius is essentially going to be focusing much on the British colonial administration and the French colonial administration. I believe from all the case studies that we have looked at so far in our webinars, either they have been one colonial rule in all of the previous case studies. In the case of Mauritius, there are two important phases of colonial administration, which I will explain. And how do we make sense of contemporary administrative traditions based on that coexistence of two colonial rule at two different phases. Did they fuse? Were they separate? And so on. So based on that, that will inform my discussion today. So my concluding remarks are very much work in progress. I don't believe that I will be reaching final conclusions per se. Rather, I'll be giving some food for thought about the discussion that we are having and how to perhaps expand on this discussion that we are having on case studies. All right. So on that note, a little bit about Mauritius first and foremost. Mauritius is a tiny little island of the east coast of Africa, more precisely of Madagascar, and it is considered to be a multicultural, multi-ethnic, and multi-religious island. And in the work of Hubert, dated from 1980s, he considers Mauritius to be very much a colonial creation. To understand that concept, that expression or statement, we need to look at the colonial history of Mauritius. And just to give you an idea, that's why I've put the location of Mauritius, because most of the time it's difficult for people to visualize where it is and how is it attached to Africa as well, as an island. So Mauritius, as I said, multicultural island located in the Indian Ocean, and it is characterized by a blend of several cultures drawn from African ancestry, Indian ancestry, European ancestry, as well as Chinese ancestry. In regards to its current overall governance score, it is considered to be a top scorer in overall African governance. From 2007 to 2000 to actually 2 years ago, it used to be #1 on the Ibrahim Index of African Governance. It is argued to be a stable democracy, and it has been doing well in several categories. Nevertheless, in the last 10 years, there have been trends to suggest that it is declining in terms of its provision of quality of public governance. So it is no longer number one. It has been overtaken by Seychelles actually this year in the latest Ibrahim Index of African Governance. So that is a little bit of background on Mauritius. And now let's delve into its history. So colonial history, similarly to other case studies that we have considered, there have been pre-colonial times, colonial period, and post-colonial time that we have focused on. Pre-colonial time for Mauritius, you could argue that there have been two instances that have been recorded in history during the 9th century and during the 16th century. Both times Mauritius were actually uninhabited, but the first explorers in the Indian Ocean were the Arabs, and they used to use the island as a port of call to repair their ship or to find resources. But they never settled on the island. In fact, there were other explorers as well that have used the island for such reason during that time. During the 16th century, Mauritius remained an uninhabited island, and the first Europeans in the Indian Ocean, they actually were the Portuguese. And under the quest of finding India and so on, there were several missions in order to be looking out for numerous resources, but there have been exploration mission, and the Portuguese as well use Mauritius as a port of call for ship repairs, finding resources, and so on, but they did not settle. First colonization that have happened was during the 17th century, where the Dutch, again, using maps that were that they discovered, be it from the Arabs or even from, more recently in their case, from the Portuguese. They managed to find the island and they named it Maurits, after the Dutch Prince Maurice van Nassau. So the idea of Mauritius being the Latin name that's used in English, but it's actually a Dutch name after the Dutch prince from the 17th century. And during the 17th century as well, the Dutch colony settled. Okay, there were about 300, but no more than 300 inhabitants during the Dutch rule. And in 1710, on 17 February, the last Dutch settlers left. And one of the reasons that they left is argued to have been because of poor governance and poor administration. And they were not able to control the resources on the island without exploiting it. And they introduced a lot of predators as well on the island that actually caused harm and that actually impacted on how they were administering the island. So, and also the island was very much vulnerable to cyclones and climate conditions that were not favorable to them, but it was also linked to poor colonial administration under the Dutch colony, which is why they choose to left and not to settle there. And yes, you may know the dodo, and the dodo is commonly argued to have been extinct because of Dutch, and they basically ate all of the dodos. So, but remember, it was a big animal that was not used to humans around it, and there are several reasons as to why it went extinct quickly once the first settlement happened. French colony began in 1715, and under the French colony, Mauritius was known as Île-de-France. And from 1721, it was under the governance of the Compagnie des Indes, so the French East India Company. They were in charge of administering the justice for administration of the island. And it was only in 1767 that the French crown actually asked the administration to be handed to the French governor in residence at that time, rather than the private company of the Compagnie des Indes. And the French colony actually was overpowered by Britain in 1810, and they had to surrender the island to the British colonizers. And British colony began in 1810. But in the meantime, of course, there was the negotiations happening about how the handover was going to happen between the French and the British. And in 1814, there was the Act of Capitulation, according to the Treaty of Paris. And in there was, first, Mauritius was renamed from Île-de-France to Mauritius, according to the English language. And under the British colony in 1832, there was a new British constitution that was instituted. Important timeline of events as well during the British colony include the abolition of slavery, that we should not overestimate, rather underestimate as a key event, because it meant that they had to find alternative sources of labor, and which led to the idea of the arrival of indentured laborers. And that shaped the multi-ethnicity of the island that I will explain in a bit. In the 1840s, there were constitutional reforms, and in 1938 as well, there was the first labor union formed. And in the 1960s, the British colonizers were anxious to get out as well, and which led to the independence of Mauritius in 1968, where Mauritius became an independent country. It was shaped by colonial state legacies. And 24 years later, still independent, but it became a Republic of Mauritius, and the first president was appointed. So this is a brief overview of the colonial history. And I want to focus on the French colonial administration. And between 1715 and 1767, as I said, France, Île-de-France rather, belonged to the French East India Company that was responsible for administering justice, setting up a police system, trade, military, and even the marine departments. It was only in 1767 that the administration was transferred as per royal orders to the French general governor in residence. And the first French governor was Marie de la Bourdonnais. And one of the statues that you see here on the photo, it's of him. And the statue is still here in Mauritius today. So the king issued letters of patent, and it also meant that the sort of laws that would be followed in Mauritius were going to be according to the Napoleonic codes, and the laws that apply there also extended to Mauritius, and that have continued today, despite a British administration in the later century. Despite that, we still have French influences over contemporary Mauritian law. And during the French administration, generally speaking, there was no fault that was found with the administration of justice, and there was no deeply rooted popular discontent that assailed the existing form of government. Yes, there were some sort of key events not to overlook again because of the French Revolution happening in France and how that shaped sort of groups in the country at that time, but they were minor. In fact, some of the dissidents as well, they did not manage to put political pressure on the French governor of the time, and they actually were deported back to France. Under the French crown, the governor was in charge of administration of military matters, and there was an intendant that was put in charge of control of finance affairs. And these roles were given based on the crown's appointment. And during the French colonial administration, a lot of the infrastructural development, notably in the city center known as Port-Louis, developed, namely under the colonial administration governorship of Adeelah Kodabux. The island grew more than just a military and trading center. It became home to many settlers, and the white inhabitants, as far as they were concerned, at that time, according to the literature, there was no great gulf that was found between the different classes. At that time, it was argued that there was not one class that would be taking privilege over another, and there was not such a powerful priesthood as well that would be overshadowing sort of the colonial administration per se. So, as I said, during the French colonial administration, the governors did not create local laws per se. They administered the colony according to Napoleonic codes, but they were also not pressured to make new laws. Although they were not pressured to make new laws, they were considerate of local customs and traditions. And between 1789 and 1810, very important because of war between, the British and the French. French colonists capitulated to the British forces. As a result, as well, Mauritius started to develop itself as a kind of independent state. It was still a colony, but it started to develop its own kind of independent existence, which was rare at that time among French dependencies. When France surrendered sovereignty of a colony to Britain, they acted in the interest of the inhabitants and actually stated in writing in the Act of Capitulation that the responsibility for the British administrators, they needed to respect local customs, laws, and religions in the running of state practices. Meaning that once the British took over, as from 1810, they were not creating a sort of new traditions from anew all over again. Rather, they were going to build on local customs that existed, laws that existed, and religions that existed. So that was very important because it is part of one of the influences about the sort of fusion or hybridity that we need to think about contemporary colonial administration in Mauritius. So moving on from the French colonial administration to the British colonial administration. So the respective governors of the time, they managed the island according to the British Crown's order and the constitution of the time. They accommodated constitutional changes such as to allow a more representative form of government. And that actually, again, was quite sort of unique in comparison to other crown colonies. And the overall essence of governance under the British colony as well remained very state-centric in the sense that it was concerned with state development first and foremost. Under British colonial administration, as I said, there was a continuation of previously established laws by the French colony, but also there was an introduction of English law. And as I said, the influence of French law remains very much tangible today in several key areas of Mauritian law, particularly in the realms of civil, commercial, and criminal law. In regards to languages as well, yes, language was very much prominent under the British colonial administration, but they also allowed the continuation of the use of French as well, which is why today we are French speakers in Mauritius, we are English speakers, we also speak Mauritian Creole, which is a local dialect that is very much sort of influenced by French words as well. So during the British colonial administration, the colonial administrators required the governor as well to interact with the elected representatives who essentially represented politically and socially conservative Franco-Mauritians of the time. And as I said, very important timeline, 1835, key event in the timeline with abolition of slavery. And between 1834 and 1920, there began the arrival of indentured laborers. And most of them, they were brought from India, but not just from India. There was also from parts of Africa and also from other parts of Asia as well. But majorly, it was Indians from India that started to reshape the multi-ethnicity of the island. They brought in a radical and permanent change in the ethnic composition of the island. In 1835, they formed only a tiny fraction of a population of 100,000, of whom 80,000 were slaves at the time. But by 1861, they represented 2/3 of all inhabitants. And this proportion has been maintained to the present day. That's actually extracted from a literature dated from 1980s. Obviously, the numbers have increased today. And on the photo here on the right-hand side from the National Archives of Mauritius, this is an example of Indian laborers on a sugar estate, because they helped with the development of sugar mills and sugarcane plantation, which was, Mauritius was a monocrop economy, highly dependent on sugarcane and export of sugar. Regarding the idea of the Franco-Mauritian who were there during the French settlement and French colony, the Franco-Mauritians, even during the British colonial time, they regarded themselves as the original Mauritians, and they regarded all of us as immigrants, since even during the Dutch time, they had no settlers left behind. So the Franco-Mauritians considered themselves as the original Mauritians. The Francos, as they were called at that time by some, included a small group of planters and sugar mill owners, and they controlled the island's economy and profited hugely from the export of sugar to Britain. And ironically as well, they actually benefited from imperial preference. The early pursuit of capitalist agriculture was associated with huge distance on every dimension for the majority of the population. And the French settlers as well, they provided the bulk of the island's magistrates, police force, they spoke French, and they even sent their children to France in order to be educated and to come back and in order to continue the governance system administration according to the colonial time. And of course, this idea of the sugar mill owners and so on, and the estate workers faced some sort of conflict. There were labor revolts as well, namely in 1937 and another one in 1943. And estate workers eventually in Mauritius were able to organize themselves collectively and to form a labor union as well. Again, quite a unique feature as well. But remember, all that time, Mauritius was sort of, even under a British colony, was allowed to have its independent existence. And the colonial office in London generally dragged their heels, and they were not actually keen on bringing reforms from their level, but actually the reforms that were coming, they were from below. and from the grassroots level here. And for example, the allowing of labor unions to be formed, the creation of a labor party, and of course the creation of a first legislative council in 1948. The first general election under a new constitution was in 1948. It established a legislative council that after 1968 became the Legislative Assembly, and as from 1992 became the National Assembly. But the point here is 1948, the Legislative Council was able to elect 19 elected members. There were 12 appointed members and 3 ex-officio members. And it was majorly won by the Labour Party that constituted mostly of Hindus. However, the British governor at that time appointed 12 conservatives to ensure the dominance of English and French speakers. These are important aspects to consider because we have shaped as well the way that the electoral system, the political system has been shaped. It followed a Westminster model, a first past the post system inspired by the British system, but it accommodated for specific ethnicities through the best loser system, which I will get to in a moment. But just to highlight, in 1968, as I said, Mauritius gained its independence from the British, but the idea of the British exiting the island happened sort of in a process. In 1960s, the British colonial administrators started to organize the process of organizing transfer. But according to the work of Hubert, the decolonization was merely a rearrangement of the internal balance of political power, and the colonial government played a major role in ensuring that there would be a continuity in the internal structure of a society, as well as maintaining the links with Britain. So hence the explanation for the leisurely pace set by the British, because although electoral and constitutional reform started in 1948, the island did not become independent until 1968. And it is argued one of the reasons that they left the island in 1968 was because in the 1960s, Mauritius was not seeming to be a very profitable economy. In fact, according to a report that was published by Nobel Prize winners James Mead and Naples, they argued that Mauritius in the long run will fail because it relied solely on the monocrop agriculture based on the sugarcane, and it would not be able to develop because of its climate conditions, the cyclones, and so on. So, and of course, let's remember in Africa as well, during 1950s, 1960s, there was a process of decolonization happening. And at one point or the other, the decolonization of Mauritius was going to happen. But the point here, it happened. And another important aspect to consider, generally post-colonial, post-independence, it had been noted because how the country would organize itself. So there is an expectation that there would be sort of conflicts among the multi-ethnicities post-independence. In the case of Mauritius, the sort of conflict was in the air pre-independence. In fact, they anticipated in 1968 that there would be violence, but it did not happen after 1968, but it was just something in the air. In fact, there were ships as well in the harbor at that time, ready to intervene should there had been any sort of violence, but it did not happen. But of course, post-independence political system in Mauritius, the electoral system is very much shaped by the British times. And contemporary Mauritius is known as a republic, and same as Ghana, it is a parliamentary democracy. But in the case of Mauritius, it is based on the Westminster model, and it is based on the first past the post system. However, a major influence that we have as an add-on to the first past the post system is that it allowed for sharing of power by various ethnic communities. And in fact, in the constitution of Mauritius, there are 4 main communities, and they are labeled as the Muslims, Hindus, Sino-Mauritian, And anyone that does not fit the category of a first three, they are known as general population. And even today, in 2024, these categories are used in order to identify members who would like to pose as political parties and the community that they belong to, because they can make use of a best loser system in order to get into parliament based on number of votes and so on. So this image that you have here on the right-hand side, it gives you an idea of a number of constituencies in Mauritius. There are 21 constituencies, and the constituencies as well were demarcated according to a British colonial period, and it remains the same to date. And this image is fresh. In case you have been following the news, Mauritius, we had our National Assembly elections on Sunday. The results were announced on Monday. And this is a result here, first past the post system. And we have 60 members of the same alliance. Essentially, at the moment, there is a weak opposition. And so it's just showing you how the Alliance du Changement, the one that is currently the ruling power, is red everywhere. So the point here is, in addition to the direct election of 62 members to the National Assembly, 2 being from Rodrigues, the Constitution of Mauritius provides for 8 additional seats to ensure the fair and adequate representation of each community. These additional seats are known as the best loser system, and they are awarded to the communities that are underrepresented following the direct election. Thereby the point here of political candidates identifying the community membership. And many of them over the time have used it strategically in order to get a seat and so on. So only candidates from political parties are eligible for best loser seats, and the best loser seats are categorized into 2 sets of 4 seats. The first 4 are awarded on a community basis, regardless of party affiliation, provided the candidates belong to a party, and the second set is based on a community basis. It has been argued that the first past the post system is very much outdated, that Mauritius is in need of a more proportional system of electing members of parliament, but that discussion has been in the air for so many years now, and there are many political or strategic reasons why perhaps no ruling government has done so far. But yes, we still need to watch how the current ruling party is going to address this point in the upcoming days. In regards to the legal system of Mauritius, as I said, it's very much a fusion of different administration systems. When the British gained sovereignty over Mauritius in 1810, as I said, they promised to leave the customs and laws of the people untouched, but at the same time went by, the English presence obviously altered not only the methods of administration of the island, but also matters of private law. So today, the law is basically that of Napoleonic France with a strong overlay of English law, particularly in the commercial field. And of course, legal system is made up of Supreme Court, and there are different professional careers in here, barristers, solicitors, notaries, judges, and so on. Regarding contemporary administrative traditions in Mauritius, since I'm a little bit short on time, I just want to address here the influences that we need to that we can extract from both colonial phases in Mauritius. Of course, contemporary administrative traditions in Mauritius have been influenced and continue to be influenced by colonial heritages. Yes, the French capitulated to the British in 1810, but actually they made sure that there was going to be a retention of local laws and customs that the British, of course, managed to follow, while at the same time altering the administrative system as well according to their governance system. Language, very important. Language is very important because even in regards to French laws and how they were created, British laws, how they were created, And there are words as well that have transfused from one colonial times to the other. They have played a role. French-speaking times, English-speaking times, or even in the multi-ethnicity, multicultural framework of the island. And development reforms have been inspired as well by the desire of the post-colonial administration to distance themselves from the history of British colonial rule. But there is an argument as well that colonial influence have in the first 2 decades post 1968 very much influenced the development of the island. Constitutional influences have been accommodated in order to suit local ethnic diversity, namely through the best loser system. And according to the work of Miles, Mauritius had embraced its dual colonial heritage for the very purpose of managing ethnic conflict, ethnic diversity, and also to promote development based on its multicultural heritage. As I said, my concluding remarks are very much work in progress, and there are a lot that we can continue to discuss and narrow down about contemporary administrative systems in Mauritius. But because of time limit, I just want to leave some food for thought. How do we make sense of contemporary administrative traditions in Mauritius? I know the words fuse, hybridity, hybrid, mixed are commonly used and they are seen as similar. But I'm thinking, could we narrow down or could we refine what do we mean by fuse? What do we mean by hybrid? Especially given the example of Mauritius and the fact that it had two very prominent long years of French colonial administration and British colonial administration. If it is fuse, do we understand that it stopped at one point and there was an organic connection from one colonial administration to another? And were they connected because of historical overlaps? Hybrid, I'm thinking of hybrid. Could hybrid mean that there was a crossover from one colonial administration times with another one with more intense overlaps? That is again a point for further elaboration. Could we understand that colonial administrations in modern times are a legacy? And because the way that the British administration allowed for the sort of independence of the island, even during the colonial times as well. So was it a legacy of that time? And it was inevitable to happen. Could we consider Mauritius as a unique case study in the sense of there had not been sufficient focus on the interplay between the French colonial administration times and the British colonial times in order to inform contemporary discussions on administrations of our times. So again, as I say, this is very much work in progress, and I'm very much eager to continue this discussion about something about the administration being fused, mixed, or hybrid, and perhaps being more pedantic on this concept to actually explore them and to define them for the purpose of this case studies that we are exploring. On that note, these are the list of references and where I've got my information, and I know Imam Dinas will want to have time for the question. That brings it the end of my presentation for today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adeelah, for your insightful presentation. And actually, I think the questions you raised at the end are questions we can ask for all the 6 countries we have discussed throughout the years. And I think that's really the point kind of we should make. But yeah, let's go to the audience first. Christian, you have a question, so please go on.
Thank you. I'm delighted to have 2 pairs of very competent eyes on 2 of my favorite countries. I did write my PhD on Ghanaian investment law. That's 50 years ago. And I went to Mauritius as an ILO delegate, and I found there 100 trade unions. That's 40 years ago. For a country of 1.1 million people, Yeah, very interesting. But you talked about labor revolts, so maybe not a big surprise for you. Anyhow, I have one question to both of you, the speakers. One is the role of women. What is the evolution in your two countries on the role, administrative traditions and political seats and whatever? And the second question only goes to Nana. There is this extractive industry transparency initiative, EITI, which you certainly know, and that found that local chiefs have a right to sell licenses and to sell land, even without clear consultation or whatever consensus in their constituencies. Is that an old tradition of the power of chiefs? And is it still really available or has it become illegal? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe Nanaya, do you want to start answering the question?
Yes, so on the role of women, I think it's an ongoing development. So if you look at public governance and even business, right? Any sector of leadership since the pre-colonial times, women have been playing more of a supporting role. But I think that Ghana has also tried to catch up with affirmative action plans and other diversity movements within the global sphere. So most political, actually since at least the 2000s, most political leaders who come into power make promises of including women more. In the past, it was more of a token sort of thing. So you might have out of maybe over 100 ministers, maybe up to maybe less than 20 who are women, but at least we're seen as a step in the right direction. I think that because the population is fast expanding and there are fewer limits on women's education now than there were before, that is poised to change. So as at now, for example, one of the presidential candidates has his running mate as a woman, right? And he has been widely tipped to win the next election. So we'll have the first female vice president. It's obviously not enough, right? It's not the same thing as having a female president or a female minister, but we do have several female ministers. The current president's chief of staff is a female. The chief justice is a female. So you can see that there are steps in the right direction and women are taking more and more of a role. It's just that it will take a few, maybe years or generations more to correct for the initial bias toward men being the more educated, men having more access to the networks and all that they needed to rise in their careers. So that's really what I think the state of affairs is. As of now, I wouldn't say that there are any limits. It's just that generationally, we have to correct for men having a head start. But there aren't any real limits. As to whether a woman will become president, at the moment, I think our politics is too dirty for that to happen because you really have to be very tough and politically, you have to have a lot of clout, money. You have to be willing to make deals and all that. And women generally are when women try to take those steps, they're seen in a very negative light. So that's more or less the double threats that works against women in terms of gaining an office like the presidency. But I see a way through in which if this, for example, if this woman who might become vice president makes it through, perhaps she could pave the way. So it's hard to tell. I think it will happen eventually, but it will take some time. Do we want to, maybe Adeelah also wants to answer that question before we move on to the next story? Yeah.
Thanks. Yes, in regards to gender representation, thank you, Christian, for the question, and thank you for your loyalty to every webinar that we have organized so far. In Mauritius, as well, there is it's very much it's very much a male-led a public service system because in the sense that, yes, there is gender representation in the parliament. And in fact, one of the promises of a new ruling party in their manifesto is to enhance gender representation. How they are going to do that, whether they are going to make that for sure by amending the constitution, I don't know whether that will happen. But in regards to statistics in the last 10 years, Mauritius has improved, according to the Ibrahim Index of African governance, by only a very small margin, by 2% in regards to women's equality. And one of the sub categories is about access to public services for women. In that category, Mauritius has really declined by actually 12 points. The point here is it indicates, yes, there have been more women in the National Assembly in the last ruling party. I still need to see how the new party, new assembly will be constituted. It's really fresh, just yesterday. And just need to see how many women are in there. And the point here is there's much work to be done in order for women to be considered as serious leader members, and that would be able to be prime minister for one day. The president role is very much ceremonial role here in Mauritius, but in regards to a future prime minister being a woman, I do not see it in the near future. I would be happy if anyone proves me wrong, but I think there's much work to be done in order to change that stereotype about who can be perceived as a leader, and that being a woman. So I don't know if that answers your question, but there's much work to be done about gender representation.
Right. Okay, so I'll just take the next question about land tenure, land ownership. It's a very sticky, very tricky issue in Ghana, and the first person to figure it out should, I don't know, maybe be president for life in my country. But the main thing is that most lands are owned by families or by traditional areas led by the chiefs. So what happens is that a lot of the time, families may, or individuals actually may own the land, but the underlying, it's more or less seen as a lease from the chief. So for example, when you buy a piece of land, it's not a freehold system, it's a leasehold usually. So it used to be for 99 years, that would be your title to the land. But now it's been reduced to 59 years in the law. So for 59 years, you're more or less leasing the land from the chief. Now, unfortunately, some areas have disputes in terms of which chief or who is the chief, because maybe there are two conflicting families that say, no, our guy is the chief, and these people say, no, it's our guy. So if you are in that kind of land and you buy land from one chief, then the other chief can probably go and sell the land to a mining company or to somebody else, and then you have conflicts. And that's what usually happens in the capital city, Accra. There are also other times when the same chief can be very duplicitous. So you can buy land from the person and also, that he would still sell it to somebody else who gives him a different price. So maybe he just spends all your money. So he goes to sell the same land to someone else. The question is, do we not have a land registration system, a land office? We do, but again, sometimes, unfortunately, those offices can be for sale. Unfortunately, it doesn't always happen, but because they know that there's already a lot of mess in that sector, they take advantage. So it just goes to show that buying land in Ghana, for anyone who is considering it, is not a straightforward venture. You need to do your homework, redo it, probably need to pay more than one person, one owner, because there can be multiple owners to the same land. And then all of that. In terms of the implications for mining and other things, usually for companies, they usually go through the government. So they have some government backing before they even go and see the chiefs as well. So they do the formal public government level engagements, but they also go and maybe present the drinks to the chiefs and pay them as well. So they engage on both sides. So that gives them a bit more legitimacy, and it's harder to cheat them. But if it's an individual or a small company, then it gets very tricky. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your response. And I think it connects really well to the open questions that Adeelah raised also, so on a specific example, so is it hybrid or is one kind of overruling the others? And I think these are really interesting questions we also want to address in the future, particularly when comparing the 6 examples. But I still want to reach out to the audience and ask whether there are still, whether you have some questions to the two speakers.
Amy,
Yes, please, Mahopodi. Hi.
hopefully I can't find my artificial hand. I just have a small question, just for clarification from Nana. In terms of local government representation, unless I misunderstood her, I thought she said at the local level, the campaign is supposed to be apolitical, meaning that the people who campaign or represent people there are not party-based. But I thought they were aligned to political parties. So when these people are elected, what are they called? I thought they were called councillors or something. But maybe just to clarify, what are these people called? I thought they were councillors or something. Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Mokopodi. So we don't call them council, we usually call them assemblymen. And they are not supposed to be affiliated with parties, but usually they'll come with their posters and the party colors are on it. So on paper, they're not supposed to be, but in reality, they are. They're usually propped up and promoted by party members. So that's unfortunately the contrast that we have. But we at the head of the MMDAs and municipal metropolitan and district assemblies, the head of that body is a district's chief executive, right? And those people are actually appointed by the president. So it's a very confusing thing where the very head is appointed by the president. The body is supposed to be apolitical, but it's really not.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And I would like to follow up. Thank you for very much for that question, Mugopori, because that's a very important feedback. When we are going to compare the case studies in more details, perhaps the names and the titles that we give to the ones holding those administrative role as well, from the colonial time to current times, it would be good to use as a comparison as well and to see, again, overlaps, complete differences, or, just actually a colonial legacy, but they are just named differently in all these case studies. So appreciate that question. Thank you.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you. Maybe still one question from the audience. There's still anything? There's no question. Yeah, so I found it really interesting again. And as I say that, I was also thinking a bit about all the 6 presentations we had throughout the year, plus Guy Peters' presentation also. And also as all the speakers are here except Jess, for good reason, because she gave birth just recently to her first daughter. That's why she can't join us today. But yeah, when I think, and this is something that I took my attention quite strongly already after the last presentation. So kind of on paper, and that was the reason why we wanted to compare these 7 examples, we kind of assumed, yeah, there is a hybridity there. We can see there are colonial influences, but also pre-colonial, decolonial influences. But when we go into the details, we can see a lot of differences still, which is quite interesting. And that's why I really liked your last slide, Adeelah, that I think these are questions we have to ask for all the 6 examples, because hybridity or fusion is so different. And so when I think, for example, the example of Senegal, Mustafa, you're representing from a really French administrative perspective, but then you still added, by the way, there's something else. So that was quite interesting because it seemed more there are 2 worlds at the same time. Maybe in Mauritius, that I also know a bit better, there might be really more kind of a fusion in a way that has occurred between particularly the French and the English system due to the history, as you have explained very well. And in your case now in Ghana, there seem to be also more kind of the role of the pre-colonial traditions. Sometimes I might exaggerate now, but seem to be still kind of more important than what is on paper and the colonial influences. I mean, these are definitely things we want to look at, particularly also when we want to gather. I would like to share with you the last slides to kind of closing the webinar, to give you an outlook about what we want to do for next year and where we are standing. So first of all, as already mentioned, we're going to have a workshop in Switzerland that is financed by the Swiss National Science Foundation, that allows us to meet all together, all the speakers except Jess, for the reason I just told you. So this gives us a good opportunity to really compare the different examples. And kind of the insights we gain, we would like to provide you then in a final webinar of this webinar series in March. We're going to communicate you the exact date. And we also have another activity for the upcoming year between April and December, where we want to look a bit at another topic, particular on the question of democratic trends in a global age of digital disruptions, lessons from Africa. For this time, we want to invite young scholars who provide some opinion pieces that we want to discuss together. We're also going to communicate all the details in order to be up to date, stay connected via either our LinkedIn page you can follow on X or Instagram, as well as on our homepage, casp.org. And of course, always feel free to reach out if you have any questions or comments. We thank you again for having joined this last webinar of this year, and hope to see you again also in the next year in 2025. Thank you very much.